parties. We're very much a community-driven organization, so if this is the sort of thing that appeals to you and you want to get involved, we would love your expertise. We are driven by the talents, intelligence, and passion of our people. Of course, if you have rich friends, we'd also appreciate those as well. So this meetup's a little bit of a kind of last-minute sort of scramble because originally I was going to have Michelle Proxel speak. She is a digital artist. She also, about a decade ago, actually curated a digital arts museum up in Dallas and had some work with the Rhizome Collective out of New York, who are one of the most famous proponents of digital art. She's also an expert on basically emerging trends in the Chinese internet. So I was very excited to book her and hear from her, but unfortunately she about a week ago contacted me and said that she just, due to unforeseen circumstances, she needed to reschedule with me. She still very much wants to give her talk at a future date, so hopefully in several months' time or so, we will rebook her talk, and anybody who really wanted to hear that and is here and didn't see my change of talk announcements and is really bummed out about that, we will have her at some point in the semi-near future, so stay tuned. So before I get to my talk and what I'm going to be talking about, and because I forgot to say, my name is Kevin Welch, and I'm the current president of the board here at EFF Austin. So I'm filling in with an emergency talk that I gave last year to Central Texas Mensa that I've not given to the meetup here yet. Before I get to that, I'm just going to do a few brief announcements about things we have coming up in the semi-near future, as well as turn things over to everybody to see if there's any community announcements anyone wants to make. So first things, we have our annual South by Southwest sort of party gathering coming up next month. That will be Saturday, March, it's 14th, I think, but whatever the Saturday of that week is, at 7 p.m. at our board member Chris Boyd's house. Expect more announcements about that soon. Full participants, I'm still sort of hashing out with certain people. I can tell you that we're going to have a couple VIP guests. If you're really into the science fiction space of cyberpunk, should be cool. We're going to have both Bruce Sterling and Chris Brown, two sci-fi luminary authors, are going to be our guests. So it's always fun to hear from Bruce and Chris, so should be a very delightful time with them. Don't spread this around too much because I don't have final confirmation from them yet, but I'm currently in talks with some of the people from Fight for the Future who are going to have some people in town for South by Southwest. They're working on a protest, actually, and we might have some people from Fight for the Future to come to the party and talk about the wonderful digital activism that they do. But yeah, it's always a fun time, and we encourage you to come out and share some drinks with us and learn more about our cause and get involved. We won't have a meetup next month because of the party, but as I said, the meetups are usually the second Tuesday of the month at 7 p.m. We have a number of people in the pipeline who may be speaking soon. Daniel from the, I'm going to blank on the name of his company, but he's associated with a group in Switzerland who's working on what they call the Web 3.0 project. We're probably going to hear from him at one of the meetups coming up. And if you're like, what's Web 3.0? It's basically people trying to build a decentralized peer-to-peer internet using blockchain applications. One of the co-founders of Ethereum is one of the founders of the company and majorly pushes the Web 3.0 initiative. So if that's a topic that interests you, we'll have that coming up pretty soon. We're also probably going to have futurist Ann Boyson talking to us pretty soon about some of the latest findings in her research. So, number of very cool, interesting people coming up in the pipeline. And finally, this is also during South by Southwest. This is something you'll probably only be able to attend if you have a South by badge, but I thought I just wanted to make you aware of it. And I'm still waiting for the final details because I believe they're running into some scheduling difficulties on their end. But EFF Austin is helping put together a panel for the 5th annual Mayor's Summit at South by Southwest, where we're going to be talking to a number of U.S. mayors about the privacy risks around smart city innovations. So if that's a topic of interest to you and you actually are lucky enough to have a badge for South by Southwest, we encourage you to come by and, who knows, maybe convince some U.S. mayors about the importance of considering these things in planning city policy. I think that's the main stuff we have coming up in the short term. Before I finally quit rambling and get to my talk, I'm going to quickly ask if anybody in the room has anything they'd like to share with the community. Shameless self-promotion is totally allowed. You know, if you think it's something of interest to the Digital Civil Liberties community that people might want to know is going on, feel free to share or make an announcement.
If you're putting together the forum for the mayors,
Yeah.
could I request that you try to record it and make it available to EFF members?
I will be speaking with my contact in Mayor Adler's office, Sly, and as I said, there's been some scheduling wonkiness where I think some of their stakeholders, they're having some unexpected trouble with the scheduling. I mean, I suppose there's a small but not 0% chance the whole thing sadly might get called off. I don't think that's going to happen. That's not what I've been told. But yeah, when I touch base with Sly again with my fellow panelists, yes, I'll see if we can get that disseminated to the public because we're very big believers in access. There's a reason our South by parties are usually unofficial and don't require a badge to get into because we want them to be accessible.
Even if you can't make it public, you might be able to make it limited release.
Yeah, I will talk to them certainly and see what we can do. I know South by, one can certainly criticize them for a lot, but to their credit, they usually do try to make at least audio recordings of things available to the public, so we'll definitely strive to do that. Anything else? Anybody got like any personal things they know going on in the city? Any projects they're working on they'd like to share? No? Cool. Oh, and one last thing, I'll just do a continual shout out like we do to let you know that our friends at the Austin Indie Web chapter continue to have their meetups on the first Wednesdays of the month at 6:30 p.m. at Mozart's Coffee. So if you're interested in like building, hackery solutions to try to help people spin up their own websites easier and communicate with each other and not need Facebook to facilitate that and actually want to build the tools that might make that possible, they're a great group of people. And they're actually going to have their annual Indie Web Summit's going to be coming up later this month here at Capitol Factory. So if you Google like Austin Indie Web, you can get some more information on that. Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to get to my talk. I'm going to give an additional asterisk. I already said I prepared this last year for a presentation I gave at the invitation of Central Texas Mensa. They wanted somebody to just kind of speak on current privacy data surveillance concerns. I will say that I prepared this for an audience who may not be incredibly educated on these topics. So for some of our longtime followers or people who really follow or are educated in this space, this might be a little more intro level. You may already know almost all of this, but we do try. I think it's good that we try to balance talks that get really technical and in-depth with ones that are more accessible for newcomers. And I think you may still learn some things you didn't know, even if you are fairly informed on this issue. I at least hope you do, or at least that I'll frame things in an interesting way. And I'll also say that because I am insane enough to be working at a startup these days, I've had a great deal of time to go back and prepare, rehearse for this. So if I'm a little hazy on a few of the things I researched for this at the time, my apologies. I'll be happy to do some more research for you later if you're really curious about something and I can't remember it. So, without further ado, I'm going to launch into the very pithily titled Nothing to Hide Yet Everything to Fear, Privacy in the Digital Age. So, for those of you who don't know, privacy is actually a universal human right. And, that's not just something that activists say, people who really like or really care about privacy. This is an actual fact. It is actually in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was declared when the United Nations was founded shortly after World War II. It was when they were trying to establish a bunch of laws and norms so that tragedies like World War II and the Holocaust would never happen again. And one of the declarations in the Universal Declaration specifically addresses privacy. It's specifically Article 12. Freedom from interference with privacy, family, home, and correspondence. And I quote the exact language in the article here. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference in his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation. Everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks. So don't let anybody who ever tries to poo-poo privacy make you feel bad for caring about it. It literally is one of your God, Goddess, Creator-given rights, and you should defend it. Now, we might ask, though, where did our concepts of privacy come from? And, why is it a universal human right? And how did humans come up with this idea that this is something we're all entitled to? Well, Vint Cerf, one of the creators of the internet, for those of you who don't know, he basically invented the TCP protocol in 1983, which is basically what allowed Tim Berners-Lee to invent the HTTP protocol and allow for the creation of the World Wide Web and web pages. So TCP is like the glue that holds the internet together. He invented it in 1983. And Vint Cerf, he's a pretty smart guy, except when it comes to biology. I'm a trained bioengineer, and one time he said some stuff about biology that made me roll my eyes. But he's an expert about how the internet and privacy works. And he has a very pithy quotation where he basically says, privacy may actually be an anomaly as far as societies throughout history have been concerned, or at least privacy as we sort of view it today. I'm not saying that people never were able to be alone in the past. They most certainly were. And actually, in the face of our modern panopticons, it was actually far easier to be truly alone in the past. But I'm speaking specifically to privacy as sort of a social concept related to that Universal Declaration of Human Rights I alluded to there. There was little to know what we might think of as privacy in hunter-gatherer societies. Everybody's survival depended on everybody else's. Communities were very tight-knit. The stereotype in fantasy literature that the small town, everybody knows everybody else and knows everything about them. There is a great deal of truth about this for a lot of human history. People lived in these small, very internet communities where they knew a lot about each other. But even back, as far long ago as the ancient Greeks, they did have an understanding that there was something special about the home space. Aristotle in his writing famously distinguished between the polis, which is the persona somebody adopts in their public or political life, and the oikos, which is the home sphere. And the roles people fulfill and present to others are very different in both spaces. Your duties and obligations are very different in both spaces. Now, why did this very public life start to change to a point where people besides just kings and royalty could have an expectation of privacy? Well, there's a number of historical developments that started leading to a greater sense of privacy. For one thing, for a lot of human history, homes were one room. They didn't really have multiple rooms in them for the vast majority of people. Suddenly, you start getting walls. There's ability to not just be private in the home, but within the home from other people in the home. Another big important thing was actually essentially the mass dissemination of the idea of confession in the Middle Ages with the Catholic Church. And this is one of those facts I would have had more at my fingertips right when I first put this together. So I don't know the exact year this happened. I want to say it was around the 12 or 1300s. But the Catholic Church basically declared that confession was necessary if you wanted salvation, and everyone had to confess, no matter your social station in life. But they also kind of declared that it was your right to have confession. It didn't matter how lowly you were entitled to get confession and have your eternal soul saved. And the Catholic Church believed that confession, since it was basically just between you and God with the priest as a conduit, it was nobody's business but yours and God's, your confession. And everybody was to receive this. So for the first time ever, there was a very universal social ritual that gave people the idea that there are certain things that were theirs and theirs alone, a sense of privacy. There were other inventions that led to a greater sense of privacy, like for a lot of human history, people shared beds in families. As the Industrial Revolution started kicking off and there was greater material goods available for more people, people could afford their own bed. This also increased the sense of privacy. In fact, the modern conception of privacy is very much tied to the 19th century Industrial Revolution. Because you can think of it that for most of history, privacy was essentially a luxury good. And as the Industrial Revolution happened, basically the cost of privacy went down as the ability to give it to more and more people was more easy to provide. So So that was the driving trend up to about the 19th century, that more and more people could expect to actually have private lives. And really our modern conception of privacy, the way we all think of it, was really solidified by Louis Brandeis, who in 1890 he was not yet on the Supreme Court, but he eventually became a Supreme Court justice. And in a Harvard Law Review article in 1890, he basically framed privacy in the way most of us think of it, and the way it's usually interpreted in the U.S. Common law legal tradition. He defined privacy as the right to be left alone. Now, what really prompted him to feel the need to articulate this as a right? Well, there were technological developments going on at the time, actually sort of similar to some of the technological developments we're all grappling with now when it comes to privacy. So about 50 years before Brandeis's opinion, 50 or 60 or whatever, there started to be the rise of photography. And so there was started to be like a permanent record of moments that previously would be lost to time. There also was starting to be an epidemic of what was termed at the time as yellow journalism, or the fake news of the day. So there was a lot of misinformation going around. There was also a lot of formerly private moments that were being captured now and disseminated to everyone. And a lot of people really felt like that their privacy was being invaded. And so Brandeis basically thought it was very important to say that despite these technological changes, that, people had a right to have a space for experiences that were theirs, that they did not have to worry about the gaze or judgment of others. Privacy is not explicitly guaranteed by our Constitution, in the sense that there is no amendment to the Constitution that says you have a right to privacy. However, it has frequently been found through precedent that there is an implicit guarantee of privacy in 4 of the amendments, the 1st, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Now, this is when we get to why things are starting to change today. You've all probably at this point heard that data is the new oil. Well, the thing is, as long as privacy was profitable, it was increasingly protected over the course of the 19th and 20th century. However, computers and the internet have made data collection highly profitable. And what this has done, actually, is it has started to turn privacy yet again into a luxury good. Because our data is worth so much money to people, we're now at a point where basically you want privacy, you have to pay for it. It is a luxury good. Now, I'm going to start pivoting into some of the ways that our privacy is under threat from big data, as it were. So one thing we hear about in the discussion of large data sets is when an entity like Facebook gathers a lot of data on us. We're assured that our privacy is not at risk because this data has been anonymized, that they've stripped the data of anything that could tie it to us. It's just a big blob of data that they can run mathematical and big data operations on, that they can sell in bulk to marketers to research about people, etc. Thing is, anonymized data is not as anonymous as they make it out to be. So as I say here, anonymized data, specifically what it does is it encrypts or removes personally identifiable information. You may see this referred to as PII from data sets. And in fact, doing this, removing PII, is required under Europe's General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR. But as I was saying, despite these safeguards, it's often quite possible to figure out real people associated with records in these anonymized data sets. One of my favorite stories explaining how this can be demonstrated is a researcher. So what they did was, New York City, has a vast taxi cab network, and it's heavily regulated, literally getting one of the medallions for the taxi cab network to be able to legally operate a taxi in New York City. Those things are literally worth $1 million because it's such a tightly regulated market. But there's a lot of public data that's made publicly available about taxi rides. Now, this data is anonymized in the sense that it doesn't say X person took this ride from here to here. It's basically a big collection of geolocation data of like, this cab with this ID went from this latitude longitude point to this latitude longitude point at this time. However, what the researchers showed is that you could correlate these trips to time-stamped photos that people had taken all over New York City. So like, somebody might just be snapping a picture and there's a taxi cab in the picture. And the taxi cab has to display its ID number. So you can like tie that to an entry in the data set. Some of these pictures caught who was in the taxi cab. Turns out some of the people in these pictures are celebrities, famous people. So suddenly, certain trips that certain famous people took at certain points. And suddenly you're discovering things like, this politician visited a house late at night that was not their spouse. Or, this judge went and visited a known drug dealer. Or, this politician who is against LGBT rights visited a gay nightclub. And my point for all of this, why I'm using these specific examples, is you may realize from my examples that every one of those people can now be very easily blackmailed. So this is not just a matter of, I don't want my privacy violated. It's literally a matter of the integrity of our public institutions, and if we don't want them subject to undue influence by those who control these massive data sets. Another example, so Imperial College London researchers showed that for these data sets, they're incredibly easy to de-anonymize to the point you don't even need a special case like the New York City taxi cab example, which is just especially fun and illustrative. They showed that if you have an anonymized data set with just 15 data points or columns or degrees of freedom, however you want to put it, that is enough data to successfully de-anonymize people 99.98% of the time. And initially you may hear that and go, really? Like just 15 data points and I can know who almost every person is? Well, it turns out that when you include that many data points, none of us are unique as we think we are. Like, imagine if I had a data set and I said one person in that data set is a 32-year-old white male who lives in Austin, Texas, who makes this much a year, and you see where I'm going. You don't have to add very many data points before I'm talking about myself. So it's basically 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, illustrated very aptly with the data sets, that the correlations in them are exponential. You do not have to scale them very much before, even with 6 billion people, you know who you're talking about. I'm going to now get to some specific examples about ways that public and private entities have endangered our freedoms and our rights via unregulated mass data collection. So for most of the people in this room, you're going to be familiar with a number of these examples, but I'm going to go through them anyway. So you may have heard of the Cambridge Analytica scandal around Facebook. But for those of you who don't know, or even those of you who do know, this might be a nice little refresher. So there was a researcher named Alexander Kogan. He was contracted by a predictive analytics firm, Cambridge Analytica, based in the UK, and they contracted him to build an app to harvest Facebook user data. Now this app was a quiz that, everybody's seen those quizzes that zoom around Facebook that people take, though they're actually much rarer than they used to be because people started getting wise to that they're dangerous. But, especially if you've been on the site since almost the beginning, like I have, you'll remember back in 2010, 2011, they were everywhere. Even then, before all this happened, I will admit I was very suspicious of them. But so this was supposed to be just a quiz, what Harry Potter character are you? But it turned out that the app wouldn't just collect the data that you entered into the quiz itself, it would scrape Facebook's API to download your entire profile, actually. And at the time, Facebook didn't have anything in place to prevent app makers from doing this. They wanted their app makers to do this because it was lucrative for them to sell this data. And it also was even worse where even if you were smart enough to not take the quiz, if any of your friends took it, you were still hosed because Facebook had it where not just that the app maker could take all the data of anybody who played the quiz, they could take all the data of the friends of anyone who played the quiz, even if that person had their privacy settings locked down to private so that you couldn't index them from a search engine or something. Still, you could get to the data through those API calls in the app. And what Cambridge Analytica did with this treasure trove of data is they provided these highly detailed profiles of people to political campaigns, which allowed for highly targeted political propaganda being directed at unsuspecting suspects who thought they were just seeing normal targeted ads and did not realize that they had been specifically chosen because they fit a very specific psychometric profile that was thought to be susceptible to certain forms of misinformation that they were pre-biased to believing. And you know, those of us who are really cynical could ask, well, even if they'd been told these ads were fake, would that have convinced them they were fake? So we're going to talk about the NSA and their PRISM program. Now, once again, for those of you who follow this space, a lot of this is probably old news to you. But for those of you who have not heard of the NSA and PRISM, I'll give a brief rundown here. So, back in 2013, former NSA contractor Edward Snowden leaked an NSA PowerPoint presentation to Guardian reporters Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras. And this was a presentation on the NSA's PRISM program that they would display to top secret clearance contractors to basically try to sell PRISM to. Now, what was PRISM exactly and what could it do? Well, under PRISM, the NSA was secretly forcing tech companies like Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, YouTube, Skype, AOL, and Apple to turn over their customer records to them, and then they also would forbid the tech companies from talking about it. You may have heard of, like, the FISA court regime. That's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978. But this court can serve what are called FISA warrants. And if you get served with one of these warrants, you're basically not allowed to reveal to anybody you were served one of them. So even these really powerful tech companies with, like, Harvard Law lawyers, if these companies are getting served with these orders, even though one could say, hey, is this legal? Well, that's the beautiful thing about a FISA court order. You can't talk about it to even question if it is legal or not. Now, what was the NSA with PRISM using their back doors together? Well, literally everything. Email, chat, video, photos, stored data, voice over IP, social network contacts, and various other records were all made freely available. And as I was sort of alluding to there, specifically, the NSA was using Section 02 of the FISA Amendments Act to authorize this. Now, the place it gets even sneakier and squirrelier is that when this law was created in the late 70s, it was only supposed to apply to foreign surveillance. However, due to the way the internet works and how packets bounce around across international borders, the NSA basically was using this to say that if your packets left the country at any point, then now it was foreign surveillance. So, to be blunt, that's bullshit, but that was the legal fiction they were using to try to justify this and circumvent the Fourth Amendment and due process. All right, pivoting real quick to talk about Google and their role in the surveillance economy. So, once again, probably not news to anybody in this room, but yet again, I'll just hammer home the scale. Google tracks literally everything we do online, and I mean everything. As you can see here, I've got some numbers, and these may be a little out of date at this point, but the worldwide reach of Google's top products: 1 billion monthly active users of search, 1.8 billion monthly active users of YouTube, billion monthly active users of Maps, 2 billion active users of Android OS, billion on Gmail, 2 billion Chrome browser installs. It's safe to say that almost every person on the planet, they have some means of watching them. And Google using these services, has built up a detailed profile of everything you do with its services. Searches, location data, email metadata, as well as a psychometric profile of what sort of consumer you are likely to be. And you may be like, oh, well, I use Firefox, and I use Proton Mail, and I don't use Maps or YouTube, and I use DuckDuckGo, and I suppose, you could be like, oh, I don't use Android, I use iPhone, though now you're just in Apple's sandbox. Kind of screwed on phones because somebody makes them. But let's say you're like, oh, well, I avoid Google products as much as I can. Well, if you're on almost any website on the internet, Google still knows exactly what you're doing because almost every website on the internet runs a JavaScript library called Google Analytics, which allows Google to track you even when you're not using its services. And, you know, I can tell you, the amount of stuff Google Analytics collects on a web page that's installed it is impressive. Literally everything you click on the screen gets logged, you know, with how long you clicked it, where you moved your mouse. Like, I mean, literally everything. This library collects it and sends it back to the Google mothership. And almost every website on the internet has it on, either because they want to collect the data, or even like somebody's just like WordPress blog. A lot of WordPress installs just come with Google Analytics on by default. You have to be like EFF Austin and turn it off if you don't want it collecting that data. And, you know, just to get into more cases of vast government overreach when it comes to surveillance, you know, sure, many of us have heard news stories about certain things coming out of China when it comes to surveillance. And I should point out, you know, there's certain things that are not in my slides that I'm going to briefly talk about at the end of this presentation because there have been certain developments since I made this, but I may get to one of those things on this slide since it's appropriate. So you may have heard that China is piloting a program called their Social Credit Score program. It has been being rolled out on a trial basis, though I actually think this is the year that they, if it's not this year, it's next year, but I think it's this year that they're actually supposed to roll it out to their entire population and it will become mandatory at that point. What is the social credit score? Well, for those of you who have seen a certain Black Mirror episode, you already know what it is. But for those of you who have not seen that, it's basically a system, think of a normal credit score, you know, where like how good you are about paying your bills determines how much money people will loan you. But imagine that extended to literally everything you do in life, and I mean everything. And China's surveillance of their entire society makes this actually possible, where every action you take is fed into a complex machine learning algorithm that will raise or lower your social credit score based on what you did. Oh, you decided to jaywalk across that street. Well, you just knocked your social credit score down a little bit. Oh, you were rude to that bank teller. Knocked your social credit score down a little bit. Oh, you helped that old woman cross the street. Social credit went up a little bit. Now, I try to be fair to my opponents as much as possible. So I will grant that much like a normal credit score, not everything the social credit score will do is necessarily a bad thing. Because, you know, it turns out people often are dicks. And, you know, yes, this system will probably make certain people think twice about being jerks to other people in public spaces. But, you know, it's one of those things where, well, there may be some good effects, but we really have to question the bad effects outweighing those good effects. Because literally everything that happens in China as a result of these systems, the Chinese Communist Party knows about it. Literally everything, which really makes anybody who maybe disagrees with the Communist Party and, you know, thinks maybe our society should be run differently, it literally becomes almost impossible to affect social change under such a system. They can squash any dissent before it even brews up. Now, not necessarily all dissent. We've seen what happened with the Hong Kong protests. But if you've maybe wondered why those protests were so extreme and why Hong Kong resisted so violently, it's because they see the writing on the wall of what will happen if they let Beijing fully implement their system. At that point, the amazing resistance they've shown might no longer be possible. And it's no joke to say you're under watch literally everywhere in China. There are cameras equipped with facial recognition software everywhere. I think I read recently that there are already over 2 billion facial recognition enabled cameras in place throughout China. And I think they intend to increase that number tenfold within the next 5 years. They're on lampposts, they're on drones. Even many police officers have facial recognition software embedded in their glasses, so they can literally look around and see who any citizen is. And actually, the sort of recent development that I wanted to bring up a little bit is we've all been following the coronavirus outbreak. Well, the true capabilities of what the Chinese state can do have actually been illustrated very starkly by this outbreak. Now, I will say that, you know, the former bioengineer in me and the epidemiologist and somebody who genuinely wants a deadly disease to be stopped and not kill people, you know, some of their coordination is downright impressive. And, you know, frankly, compared to a similar thing happening in the U.S., the fact they can exert such social control, it probably has saved some lives. But the scale of what they're capable of is quite impressive. Like, I don't know if you all saw this, but there was, you can YouTube it, but there was a video going around where there was an elderly Chinese woman who was out when there was a curfew on, when she was not supposed to be out. Within moments, a drone flew up to her, and it was being remote controlled by a Chinese police officer. And the drone basically, through the drone, he spoke to her, and he's basically like, you know, you're out violating curfew. Go back inside. Go back inside. And so on the one hand, you're like, okay, well, they're being able to control this outbreak very effectively. But it's like literally they knew instantly somebody was violating their curfew. And furthermore, we've seen that the scientist who actually spoke out and initially warned about the outbreak, he was actually, the Chinese government initially tried to silence him because he's spreading panic. And so we see that they may make claims of saving lives, but they actually probably killed a lot of lives via their extreme crackdown on the initial scientist who spoke out. Yeah, as I said, this is me just kind of extemporaneizing on a recent issue. I'd probably want more time to collect my thoughts on it. It's literally still happening, but it's fascinating stuff. All right, what happened to my background? Why is that happening? Oh, great. It looks like something weird happened with my presentation. Let's see. Why did those slides not come in? Oh, well, I can get it. 1 second. Sorry about that.
That's what you get when you criticize the Chinese government.
I know they hacked me. No, actually, I'm just dealing with cat factories having technical difficulties, and their HDMI cables aren't working, so I'm using one of their computers.
Is incognito mode enough to block the Google Analytics?
It doesn't block JavaScript. It just means that I'm not saving logins, I'm not saving cookies, that sort of thing. But it's not a no script mode. Like JavaScript scripts are still running. Most forms of surveillance can still track you in incognito mode. The main point of incognito mode is that if you're using a computer that's not yours, it won't save any of your username, passwords, or settings on that computer. But no, you should not interpret incognito mode as they don't know what I'm doing. They absolutely still know what you're doing. You need to use something more extreme than incognito mode if you really want to go privacy heavy. Just use Google Slides to finish this up. Although wait, Google Slides didn't like those slides either. Maybe I can get them in preview here. I suppose I could have just set those buggy. Okay, well let's see, I'm gonna enlarge this view and we'll use that just a sec. Where are you full screen? Yes, he says, displaying immense technical skill. All right, we'll go off this. This is fine enough. If I can keep the dang thing open. I use Macs all the time, you can tell. All right. All right, now to the rah-rah part, and where I get to evangelize my personal philosophy at you guys. Okay, so in the face of all this, you may just be like, well, dang, you know, governments and corporations, they know everything, and, you know, one's even forced to go, well, maybe it's just like a consequence of what modern technology is capable of. Like, you know, why is privacy still worth fighting for? Well, first of all, before I get into my own thoughts, I want to say that I actually recently saw a really wonderful YouTube video on the Philosophy Tube channel about big data and privacy that I recommend that you check out, because they really do lay out some very wonderful arguments in favor of the importance of privacy there. But I'm going to give you a few of my own thoughts here. This is one of the things I like to come back to the most about why privacy is important and why it should be a universal human right. At the end of the day, privacy is a power equalizer. It's a way to put the powerless on equal footing with the powerful. Basically, when those in power know everything about everyone under them, they know exactly which screws to turn such that you can never oppose them. They basically have the ability to blackmail everyone. All of us have something that we really would not like the wider public knowing about. It could be embarrassing. It could be something minorly criminal we did in our past. It could be something that, while we don't think it's wrong, due to the circumstances of the community we live in and the norms of that community, we might be unfairly and harshly punished, ostracized, and judged for. Privacy allows for those who are not in a position of power to not be abused by the majority, wherever they're found and whatever the rules of that society, because this is not unique to authoritarian governments, communist governments, or capitalist governments, or democracies. This is a feature of all of them, whatever system you choose. It's a feature of society and human natures. The majority, even a very tolerant majority, is always going, just by virtue of they don't agree with the minority by definition, they're not going to always treat them fairly. And privacy is a great way to ensure that basic rights of the minority will be respected. Because we're all entitled to certain rights that are independent of who we are and what we believe. And the majority is not always going to see their own blind spots when it comes to the things they believe that may not be just, and the people they think do and don't deserve those universal rights. So it's a fundamental safeguard against those abuses. But it's also important because it lets society experiment with new ideas. Unless you like society just the way it is, you support privacy. I can promise you that many things that most of us now take for granted as good things that society changed its mind on, the abolition of slavery, granting women the right to vote, legalizing gay marriage, decriminalizing marijuana and psychedelic drugs. I promise you none of these things ever would have happened without privacy, because these were all originally minority positions. They may seem like the most obvious basic common sense to most of us now, but as we all know, when you're the only one with an opinion, or at least you feel like you're the only one, you may not necessarily agree with the things around you being said you don't agree with, but, you know, you'll probably tactfully demur from talking about it. I mean, we all do it every day. We bump into somebody we don't see eye to eye with them, and, you know, we may not, you know, say, yeah, I agree with this horrible thing you just said, but we don't necessarily engage them on it either. And peer social pressure and the fear of ostracism and retaliation is very powerful, especially when the norms that are seen as right are tied to social constructions like that society's sense of morality or its religion. Like, let's not forget that, you know, many of these norms that have changed were very much seen as the moral position. It's what the religion of that society said was right and wrong. And, you know, privacy basically allowed people who had a feeling that maybe this stuff wasn't right. It actually allowed them to find spaces where they could learn they're not alone, and they could discuss and actually think about maybe these ideas are worth changing. And they could do that without fear of retaliation. And, you know, I named certain examples, but this is a mechanism of societal change in general. it makes me actually think, Dave, of sort of the things you've talked about the wave harmonics of like stabilization of ideas. But it's like, it's the way a complex dynamical system can refresh itself. Otherwise, it locks itself into a stasis where nobody is willing to call out the emperor and say they have no clothes, even though everybody secretly thinks that the way society is doing things is very fucked up. And, also, you may have nothing to hide right now. Like, for many of the examples I just gave, you might say something like, well, sure, in the past, if I was gay, I needed to keep it secret. But, at least, in big cities in America or Europe, I don't need to keep that secret anymore. Well, you may have nothing to hide right now, but that can change depending on who's in power. I mean, as we've seen, a lot of things we took for granted, they can change with a single election. And mind you, it goes both ways, unless you think I'm just, betraying my own political biases. I can promise you that, the way liberals are feeling under Donald Trump is the way a lot of conservatives were feeling under Obama. Norms change depending on who's in power. And privacy protects everyone across the political spectrum of making sure their fundamental rights are not violated. Because there's certain things we're all entitled to, even those of us who believe loathsome things. Let's see. Now, what else? So I'm finally just going to end by giving you, most of you probably already know these. This, as I said, was originally intended for people who aren't as knowledgeable about protecting their privacy, but I wanted to give a few little things you could do to improve your privacy in digital spaces. First of all, you should use a browser that respects your privacy. Probably Firefox and Brave are the two browsers that are your best bets. Most of the others have various problems. I mean, I'm not going to recommend Microsoft because haha, it's Microsoft. But Safari not only gives a ton of your data to Apple, but it actually has Chinese spyware in it, so I would not recommend Safari. Also, for reasons I already outlined when I was talking about Google, Google makes a great browser. I wouldn't recommend it if you care about privacy. I unfortunately am stuck using it in my day job because they make the best developer tools of any browser. But if you care about your privacy, you should absolutely not use Chrome. Everything you do in the Chrome browser, Google knows about. Even if you install a lot of privacy add-ons, they're going to learn about it. And furthermore to that point, Chrome, you can do some more research on this, but they've been making a lot of changes to their browser APIs that are doing things like making it where, ad blocker add-ons no longer work because we changed the API hooks that let them work. Google's whole business is ads. Really not that surprising. Also, they're very much, if you follow these digital issues, this is a whole nother talk, but I'll say that if you care about issues of like copyright, restricting the free and open web, Chrome is absolutely playing part in breaking universal web standards in the name of protecting copyright. So, yes, Chrome's a great browser. If you care about these issues, I strongly recommend Firefox or Brave. I know people used to say Firefox is slow, I won't use it. That's not true anymore. They've recently re-engineered it. It's actually a lot of times faster than Chrome now, so the one legit argument isn't really a thing anymore. Also, use a search engine besides Google. There's several you can use. The two I would probably recommend are DuckDuckGo and StartPage. For those of you who really have a hard time leaving Google, I'd probably recommend DuckDuckGo because they literally mirror Google search results as much as humanly possible. They'll be a little less personalized because they're not spying on you or using Google's massive profile of what it knows about you to tailor the search results. Though one could argue it actually probably would get you a little bit out of that filter bubble Google has constructed for you. Maybe give you a little more honest, non-curated, tailored search results. But yeah, DuckDuckGo, guy named Gabriel Weinberg runs it, and they really are a bunch of awesome people trying to make search on the internet more a public service and less a surveillance tool. So, strongly recommend DuckDuckGo. Also, whatever browser you use, Firefox or Chrome, I recommend that you install a couple browser extensions that Electronic Frontier Foundation personally created to help make your web browsing experience more secure. They're called HTTPS Everywhere and Privacy Badger. HTTPS Everywhere will make sure that if a site is capable of talking to you over an encrypted communication channel, that it will do so. And if it's not capable of it, it will yell at you and say you maybe shouldn't go to this site. Privacy Badger It's basically an ad blocker, but it's smarter than a normal ad blocker. Most ad blockers use what's called white lists or black lists to decide whether a particular domain on the web should be blocked or not. Privacy Badger doesn't have a predetermined list. Rather, it uses machine learning to basically look for patterns in particular domains that are signatures of online spying, and it dynamically learns and gets smarter over time. So even if the people trying to spy on you and serve you ads change their tactics, Privacy Badger will just keep up with them and learn how to keep protecting you. So it's an awesome little tool. I highly recommend it. It's also very good for that if you're wary of certain ad blockers or JavaScript blockers like Ghostery or NoScript. If you're like, oh man, I love these, but I turn them on and they like render the page unusable because it kills every JavaScript script running on it, and some of them are needed just for the page to work. That's another nice thing about Privacy Badger. It's usually smart enough to know which JavaScript scripts are spying on you versus which ones aren't, and the page really needs them to work. So, I highly recommend. Also, if you don't have one yet, you should consider getting a VPN, which is short for a virtual private network. A VPN is basically a way for when you're browsing the public internet to simulate as if you were browsing on like a private intranet. It will encrypt all of your communications through secure encrypted communication tunnels, and a lot of VPN providers actually have dedicated networks of hosts scattered all around the globe, and it will tunnel your traffic through those hosts as much as possible. You know, I talked earlier about a browser's incognito mode doesn't really prevent you know, your internet service provider or big web entities from spying on you. A VPN actually can prevent most of them from spying on you. Now, they may, depending on the VPN and depending on all the privacy tools you have, they may still have some sense of some of the websites you're trying to visit, but they won't know what you're doing on those sites or what you're asking of those sites. So they are a massive boost to your privacy, and I highly recommend them. And also, not that I'm encouraging breaking the law, but they've also been known to get around geolocation restrictions, because you can use them to say, oh, I'm not in the US right now, I'm in France. Now, what you could do with that, well, you know, you can Google that on your own, but there's fun stuff you can do with that. Finally, I recommend that for your texting, phone calls, and video chat with other human beings, you should care about which messaging app you use. There's a whole bunch of messaging apps in this world. Most of them are bad and you shouldn't use them. Like, I know all your friends in Europe love it. Do not use WhatsApp. I cannot emphasize this enough. Not only is it owned by Facebook, so it's really no better than using Facebook Messenger. Oh yeah, sidebar. Don't access Facebook through their apps on your phone. Access it through your web browser. Run it in desktop mode if you have to. They gather far less data on you that way. Their app is a surveillance nightmare, so do not use it. But yeah, so don't use WhatsApp. 1, owned by Facebook. 2, security nightmare. There have been countless exploits that have been revealed that will let hackers completely pwn your phone. In fact, they don't even need you to actually answer their call. They've found exploits where they can just call the app, and that's enough for them to inject malware and take over your phone. So literally having the app installed is a security risk. So do not have it installed. Now, as far as the quote-unquote 3 best privacy apps when it comes to secure communication, they would probably be Signal, Telegram, and Wickr. Now, different people will tell you pros and cons to each of them. I personally am a big fan of Signal. I'll say, like, Wickr, the argument people use in favor of it, I hear it, but also I'm kind of like, I don't know. Basically, people say Wickr is safe because it's actually the one that a lot of special ops use to communicate. So the argument is, well, they wouldn't backdoor their own thing now, would they? And I'm kind of like, yeah, they would. So if you think that's a persuasive argument that, you know, that 3-letter agencies, the very app they use to securely communicate is probably secure, well, if you buy that argument, you know, Wickr's probably decent. I'm a little skeptical of that argument. But some people think it's a good argument, so I figured I'd share it. Telegram, fine, but I guess at the same time, really, the reason I tend to stand for Signal is just because of the people who make it. Signal's actually made by and for hackers and digital privacy advocates and activists. A very famous hacker named Moxie Marlinspike created Signal and the Signal protocol. If you've ever read some of Moxie's papers, which I've tried to, and most of you just realized I'm not as smart as Moxie, Moxie's a genius at this stuff and the real deal. I know enough math to at least be able to read it and go, okay, this person knows what the dang hell they're talking about. So that's my recommendation. Use Signal. For a long time I thought that it did everything except, well, you can't video chat on it, but turns out, nope, it can even do that. So, and literally phone calls. You don't even have to use your phone's built-in phone app. So I recommend making the switch. It's nice to know that hopefully the conversation you're having is only being had with the person you intended to have it with. I mean, they can break the encryption, but they'd have to actually be interested in you. They couldn't just dragnet the conversation. All right, I'm about to close here and take any questions anybody might want to have or anything they want to go more in depth with me on, because as I said, this was kind of an introduction talk. Although when I do close, I will actually briefly sidebar on one topic before I turn it over. But I'm going to end here with a dear friend of ours in this community with a quote of his that I just feel especially relevant given the talk I just gave. Edward Snowden, who I talked about earlier in the presentation, the NSA contractor who revealed the PRISM program, has a really wonderful quote that I think really captures a lot of why privacy is really so important. And he basically says that arguing that you don't care about the right to privacy because you have nothing to hide, it's no different than saying you don't care about free speech because you have nothing to say. And this is where I would close, and people could clap if they want to. But as I said, I want to do a little sidebar real quick because I think it's also going to tie in well to some of the stuff we're going to hopefully be talking about South by Southwest at our panel with the mayors, and also hopefully some of the stuff that we're going to be trying to discuss and rabble-rouse at our party about. But some of you have probably heard a very disturbing development in the news recently. You may have heard of a little company called Clearview AI. Now, for those of you who haven't heard of them, I will get you up to speed. So, Clearview AI was a shadowy machine learning company that nobody had heard of until a bunch of disturbing reports started leaking about them. That what they'd done is they built software where they basically claimed that they had the best image recognition software in the world, where what you could do is you could feed their software a picture of anything. Now, it could be an object, but it could also be a person, a picture of them, any picture you want. You feed it to their software. What their software can do is it can pull up absolutely every publicly available picture of that person or that whatever on the entire internet. Like every picture. Doesn't matter if it's indexed with that person's name or associated with their account. It could be some picture of this person that a total stranger snapped of them on the street while they were in a foreign country and then uploaded to their Slovenian blog. This software finds that picture when you put this person's picture in there. So it literally can completely retrieve the entire digital ghost of any person on the planet. Now you may ask, how the hell did they build a tool that does this? Well, they broke the law. What they did was they illegally scraped the APIs of all major web services, Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And you're not supposed to do that. It violates their terms of service, but they didn't care. And now they have this massive database they've amassed of these billions of pictures that are technically publicly available via these APIs, but you're not supposed to mass spam them to get all the pictures. But they did that, and so now they basically, you can construct the entire digital history of every human being on the planet. And just to hammer home other developments that make this revelation even worse, well, remember that, I talked a little bit about this when I talked about that cops in China have facial recognition software embedded in sunglasses. Well, it gets even a little more sci-fi and creepy than that. That there is a startup I read about recently that I forget their name, but they are working on contact lenses. And these contact lenses are smart contact lenses that essentially are augmented reality lenses that can do computer overlays over your vision. And they also, you can link them to apps. They're wireless Bluetooth app-enabled smart contact lenses that do augmented reality. I ask you all to do a thought experiment. If you link that technology with the ClearView AI app, you have now created a world where every human being on the planet, without there being any obvious sign that they have a camera of any kind, can look at any other human being on the planet and instantly pull up every picture of that person in existence and know everything publicly available on the internet to know about any random stranger you look at. And this power will rest in the eye of every human being on the planet. Now, that's a brave new world, and we could have a whole nother talk about those implications. But that's definitely going to be something that EFF and EFF Austin is going to continue to watch closely. I guess if you're really wondering what I would leave you with, what I would say is that you should all look into that EFF is promoting a campaign called About Face, led by their activist Nash. And About Face is about pressuring cities around the country that we need to start having laws and frameworks in place about the ways that facial recognition can legally be used in public spaces. We're not talking about banning the technology universally, because obviously that's impossible. You can't ban a technology. You can't ban knowledge. But we can talk about ways as a society that we can responsibly use technology. And the truth is, without strong laws in place regulating facial recognition and regulating people's digital privacy and rights, we're about to enter a very scary world. So it's an urgent fight, and I encourage you all to research it more and get involved. That's all I have to say on the topic. Thank you all for listening. Anybody got any questions for me that I'll have to say, sorry, I'll have to get back to you on that?
I got a whole list. I mean, at the beginning, you talked about how privacy has been determined to be a human right, but I was just wondering how does that work with the treatment of incarcerated people? Because a lot of rights get suspended in a prison environment, and I mean, people, they're still human beings even when they're in prison. So how does that work?
Well, I think you raise an excellent point that if we were actually following the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in all situations, a lot of what currently goes on in prisons would not be allowed. I mean, once again, not to wade into political hornet's nest, but I also suspect that probably most people in this room would agree with me. We have massive human rights violations going on in the immigration detention centers near the border. So yeah, human rights are violated in prison all the time, and it's a problem. And I hope we will eventually be a country that elects politicians and just comes to an understanding of that, yeah, we're treating people in a very inhumane way and something should be done about it. But no, you're right, prison violates people's privacy all the time, and I don't think that you lose that right just because you're in prison. Other questions? Yeah.
My VPN seems to interfere with certain sites I go to. I find that I go to the site, it doesn't come up, I turn off the VPN, it comes right up.
Yeah, and first of all, I forgot to say, I think it said on my slide, but as far as a VPN to get, first of all, nobody get a free VPN. Those are all spying on you. You actually have to pay for it if it's going to actually protect you and not just be spyware. I'm currently using Tunnel Bear at the recommendation of one of my hackery friends. I've been happy with it so far. But to your point, yes, there are certain digital signatures present in packet headers that can let a smart network administrator running a server know that the that the person trying to hit the server is using a VPN. Now, it won't necessarily let them know who that person is or where that person really is geophysically located, but they can look and go, okay, this isn't normal internet traffic. This has been run through a VPN. And yes, services like Netflix, who have a vested interest in you not using a VPN to get around their geolocation restrictions, yeah, they may just block the site entirely and be like, you might be a legit paying customer. You have your VPN on. Don't care. Turn it off or I'm not going to work. And so, yeah, you know, it's like, it's a digital arms race always in these things. VPN providers will figure out how to get around the websites knowing that they're using a VPN and trying to block them. And then the websites will figure out how to detect that. And it just goes back and forth. So, you know, it might be as simple as, well, maybe research the particular sites you're not being able to get on, because it may be that your VPN can't get around it, but maybe another VPN can. You can do some research, because different ones of them can get around different sites. Oh, and also, whatever you do not use NordVPN. They don't know what they're doing. They had a massive security leak recently. Your data is not safe with NordVPN, so do not use, even though they're one of the ones you pay for, so do not use Nord. Yes?
Philosophically, I think we're entering a time when privacy is becoming conflated with secrecy, and vice versa, where governments can say, why is this a secret, when really it's just private information. And governments are saying, no, this is secret, when really it's public information, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And it's becoming this a really nasty web of trying to figure out where privacy fits in a world that in which we want to honor our free speech, we want to hold politicians accountable for their quote-unquote secrecy that they're claiming is private, or for government security.
Mm-hmm.
And again, for private citizens, well, what do you have to hide? Why are you being so secretive when you're under interrogation or investigation?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that this is really one of the, biggest philosophical inquiries of our time right now.
No, I absolutely agree. And I have two thoughts that sort of bridge off that. One, we recently, this last Saturday, actually had one of EFF's senior lawyers in town, David Green, one of their civil liberties lawyers, and we kind of touched on this topic where he pointed out that a lot of the stuff we fight for in these spaces, these rights we care about, that there's actually a fundamental tension at play in the rights we're fighting for that are sometimes a bit mutually exclusive with each other. I think he put it very pithily when we don't always realize this, but First Amendment, freedom of speech. Fourth Amendment, protection against unreasonable search and seizure, which is usually the amendment most interpreted as guaranteeing the right to privacy. So First and Fourth Amendment. It turns out that if you take the right to free speech to an extreme, or you take the right to privacy to an extreme, the two rights are actually in conflict with each other. They can become mutually exclusive to each other. Because it turns out the right to say anything might actually violate somebody's privacy. And the right to privacy might violate somebody else's right to say anything. And this is why it can actually be, it's easy to go, oh, these politicians, they're such hypocrites. Why are they making such bad laws around this stuff? If you're really intellectually honest, actually legislating wisely on these issues is not easy. Because there is this fundamental tension. Part of being a good lawmaker and steward on these issues is threading that fine needle between making sure both rights are respected. And as far as threading that needle, this is kind of my own personal thought on it, but I often like to say radical privacy for the powerless and radical transparency for the powerful. So I think the way to write laws that thread that needle is looking at the power relationships of the people involved. I mean, to put a bit of my own opinions on the table, and I know some people might think they're radical, I think they're reasonable, but I basically am the opinion that if you run for public office, you forfeit a lot of your right to privacy. That just comes with the job. You work for us and we have a right to know a lot about you. That being said, I think if you're a private citizen, especially one who does not have much social or political capital or power, I think that almost everything you do is nobody else's business if you don't want it to be, and no government or corporation has the right to look into your business. Might be an extreme position to some, but I think it's a pretty reasonable framework to try to guide our laws under. Anybody else got some questions? You.
So the Equifax breach,
Yes.
which probably had a a lot of people's social security numbers.
Yes, it did.
So should we all be getting identity protection? Like,
Well, I mean, certainly a lot of banks and credit unions do offer basic identity monitoring, usually for something very small, like $5 a month. It's a decent thing to look into, you know, it can be just an added bit of protection. I mean, what I will really say,
It's the sunny side of a data breach.
yeah, and I mean,
We all
look,
get free credit monitoring.
I mean, I'll say but actually as far as more practical advice around the issue, which is, you know, it's very hard to protect yourself against when a big corporate entity screws up their security and your data gets compromised. But there are steps you can do to try to protect yourself. First of all, if you're wondering whether your data was compromised, there's a good site you can check called Have I Been Pwned? Now you should Google it because it's spelled a little weird, so don't just type that into your browser. But Have I Been Pwned? If you put in your usernames or email addresses to the site, it will tell you if they were in a data breach, a known data breach somewhere. So it's very good to know if one of your accounts might have been, you know, compromised. And now, it doesn't necessarily mean somebody's actually hacked your account. It just means, well, the username and password for that account may be publicly available out there in a big data set for sale on the dark net. And somebody might try to have a script fire everything in that data set at Facebook or LinkedIn and hope they get in. And your account might be one of the ones that gets unlucky. Another thing I recommend, and you know, this is something all of us could do better on. You know, a lot of this stuff don't, you know, not to say which things I do and don't do. I don't pretend to be perfect necessarily on everything I preach. You know, it's, you know, it can be a full-time job to protect yourself from this stuff. But what you should look into is seriously consider getting a password manager. You don't want to reuse the same password for every single service. Now, if you're going to reuse a password, make it a really hard to guess one, but ideally you don't reuse the same password. Get a password manager. Actually, if you Google, EFF has a surveillance self-defense kit on their website that's really a wonderful resource people should read. But they have recommendations about password managers because, you know, you might be like, ooh, but can I trust the password manager? I forget the name, but EFF has a free and open source password manager that they recommend. Because it's open source, you can be reasonably confident the password manager is not spying on you. But if you want to, I'll give you another tip. If you're so paranoid that even with an open source password manager, you're like, I don't know about trusting this program, you don't have to use the raw passwords the password manager spits out for you for each of your services. You can do what's called salt the password, where let's say it gave you a random string of letters and numbers and that's supposed to be your Facebook password. Well, you could take that random string of letters and numbers and put on the end of it Facebook. And then that's your password for Facebook. So both it's really hard to guess because it was randomly generated by the password manager and it's unique. But technically the password manager doesn't know your password either because you've modified it somewhat. So you really want to go down the protect yourself rabbit hole, that'd be my recommendation. Anybody else got some question?
How dangerous do you think it is to use your phone, text and calls, since phone, I don't know how common it is for phones to be, I forget the term for it, but taken over.
I mean, I know what you're referring to. It's basically, it's a SIM attack where like people can fake your phone number and stuff like that. Well, that's one of the main ways people actually break two-factor authentication. Oh yeah, that's another tip that I didn't mention in the slide. You should try to enable two-factor authentication on as many services as you have. There's a recommendation in the security community that security is something you know and something you have. The something you know is a password, the something you have is your phone. The idea being that it's much harder to break into an account where you need both. But yeah, to your point, there are ways to break two-factor, and one of the common ways is people can do SIM spoof attacks and can pretend to be your phone and your phone number, defeating the what you know part. I mean, it's getting more common as more people are using two-factor. I mean, this is one thing that people should take away from this talk in general. There's no such thing as perfect security, and I don't care how much of a genius lead hacker you are, you can get pwned. Someone will pwn you. And I mean, the truth is, like, if you ever become a big enough person of interest to somebody like the NSA, everything I'm telling you is pointless.
Or Bezos.
Or Bezos, potentially. Well, yeah, that's actually a very good example, because y'all may have heard this story about how Jeff Bezos, it's so crazy. It's literally out of a cyberpunk novel. But, so, you know, there was a story a while back about how Jeff Bezos, somehow his phone got hacked, and a bunch of incriminating pictures of him with his mistress got leaked to the National Enquirer. And it was thought that this had happened, well, and it's obvious it happened, because Bezos owns the Washington Post, which has been very critical of Donald Trump, and the National Enquirer is owned by a dude who's buddies with Donald Trump, so do the math. Of course, I normally will not say anything nice about Jeff Bezos, and I mean, you know, certainly I'm very happy that in the fallout of all of it, his wife got half his money. But I normally don't say anything nice about Jeff Bezos, but I will give him this. Dude will not let himself be blackmailed. When the Enquirer privately contacted him and told him, you better stop running negative coverage of Trump or we'll leak these photos of your affair, Bezos basically just said, leak it all, don't care. I'm not going to be blackmailed or silenced. So that's actually one of the only times I've actually had much respect for Bezos, actually. But
who hacked him?
I'm going to get to that, yes. So, how did his phone get hacked? Turned out Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman called him via WhatsApp and sent him a video file that injected malware into his phone. So yeah, the Saudi Crown Prince personally hacked Jeff Bezos' phone. I mean, it sounds too ridiculous to be real. It's like a plot point of a novel, but it actually happened. Yeah, so the truth is, all this advice I'm telling you, if you become enough of a person of interest to the elite hackers of the world, they can break through anything you do. I mean, literally anything, because there's no such thing as a system with perfect security. There's vulnerabilities in all of it. Even a guy as knowledgeable as Edward Snowden can get pwned if the NSA aims all their might at trying to break into his shit. So, you know, the way to put it is this. The advice I'm giving you is not like you will never get hacked or never have bad things happen to you. It's the same reason why you lock the door to your house. It's not that somebody can't still break into your house. You just don't want to be the weak lamb at the back of the pack that the wolf eats. You want to make it enough work to get pwned that unless somebody really powerful is personally interested in you, they won't bother. That's the goal of all this. Yeah.
You mentioned a video earlier that, some YouTube video that talks about philosophy of privacy and freedom.
Yeah, it's on the channel Philosophy Tube.
Philosophy Tube?
Yeah, and they have a video, I think it's like their video on data. Yeah, it's really quite wonderful. It's basically like sort of a Socratic dialogue around like a dude arguing for privacy and another dude who he also plays arguing against privacy. And especially if you've ever been in one of those conversations where you're talking to one of those people who's like, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. It's basically, this video is a manual for how to have smart responses to those people and intelligently counter their arguments with well thought out reasoning. But I highly recommend it. I mean, I'm not going to be able to quote it exactly, but I kind of remember one of the arguments he uses at the end. I thought it was just, I hadn't quite ever heard somebody put it this way before, but I thought it was very nice. You know, the dude who's like not arguing against privacy is like, look, why do you care? Like, look, at the end of the day, if all this surveillance helps stop crime, and everybody knows it's happening and nobody really cares at the end of the day, why do you care? And his reply is basically, I care because it means I can't talk to you as an equal. All these algorithms are shaping my behavior to do things I don't want to do, to support goals I may not agree with, or that I may not even understand. And, you know, I just think we should ask what kind of society this makes us. Like, what does it, you know, that basically I shouldn't have to be constantly compromising my freedom, And you, the one doing the surveillance, shouldn't constantly be having to do that to other people just to make a living. Like, what kind of society is it that, I'm trying to get into this nightclub and you're subjecting me to unwanted surveillance for like $13.50 an hour? Like, I shouldn't be forced to be subjected to that, and you shouldn't be forced to have to do that to me. We're all victims in this system. Even those doing the surveillance are victims in this framework. Yeah.
So, obviously privacy is important, but I guess, do you think there's any sort of point where it's, where okay, so like, do you think there's any point where it's like kind of too late for someone as far as kind of like toothpaste in a tube, like, with Equifax, your social security's out there, that's it, you only get one of those, and like, even if you start using like DuckDuckGo, if you've been using Google for however long, they've already built a model on you. So what are those?
Well, I have a few thoughts. First of all, I would say the argument that, like, yes, there's a lot of permanently compromised data, to me is really just evidence that we need, reforms. Like, maybe the fact that all of us have immutable social security numbers, maybe that's not actually a very smart system in the face of modern technology. Maybe we should revisit how social security numbers work. Maybe, you'd want similar to two-factor. Maybe you'd want time-issued pins in conjunction with a social security number to make them valid for a particular transaction. There may be tons of problems with that idea. I literally just thought of that right now. But my point is, I don't think that means that, we should just say, oh, well, we're already all screwed. We built these systems. We can, address the flaws in them and rebuild them. But also, to your point, well, first of all, I would argue that, yeah, Google may already know a ton about you, but, there's still some regained privacy if you, say, well, they're not going to know things about me going forward from this date. For all they know, if I've completely blocked their location tracking of me, I might have moved and they don't know anymore. Now, really letting Google not know where you went is hard to almost impossible. I'm just using that as a hypothetical. But I would argue it's still worth trying to reclaim what of your privacy you can, even if a lot of it's already out of the bag. But also, another thing, which is, you talk about, they already know so much about me, they can already predict so much. Well, the truth is, despite all their lofty claims that they know everything about you and they know exactly what to sell you and they can exactly predict your behavior with this machine learning stuff, well, a lot of that's frankly somewhat inflated as far as what they're actually capable of, because, hey, if they portray themselves as gods in their capabilities, well, that's very profitable to anybody they can convince that they can tell you anything about what you will or won't do. There have been a lot of studies where, if you compare, random advertising to highly targeted advertising of the type Facebook sells and uses, turns out you only increase sales by 4% despite all that surveillance. So it's not even making anybody any much more money. It's not actually very accurate. I'm sure you've seen this yourself, that you'll get an ad for a car right after you bought a new car. Well, the ad would have been great if I got it right before I bought the new car, but it's completely useless now that I bought the car. I'm not going to buy another one for 7 years. The algorithm wasn't even smart enough to go. It couldn't predict I was about ready to buy a car. It just saw, oh, he bought a car. I'm going to recommend cars to him. So, frankly, this is one thing you should keep in mind in general. And I say this to everybody in this room. And once again, that's a whole nother talk. But a lot of what they claim machine learning can do, a lot of it's marketing hype. It is very miraculous, some of what it can do, like the uncannily believable pictures that it's generating these days. That's awe-inspiring, and frankly, when you think of all the implications, a little terrifying. So there's some legit magical stuff it can do. But there is a lot of phrenology, snake oil BS vendors try to sell about what can be predicted with this stuff. They'll try to claim, I can look at your face and tell you everything about you just from your facial expressions. I tried one of these algorithms just because I was curious what it would predict about me. It was very accurate about the emotion my facial expression was conveying, whether I was smiling or angry or sad. But all the other stuff it tried to infer about me, you know, like how much money I make, sexual orientation, whole bunch of personal stuff it tried to guess just from my facial expressions. It was all hilariously wrong. Like, wasn't even close. And now I realize anecdote is not data. But, like, I'm just saying, this stuff is not as accurate as they want to say it is. And I really do think a lot of it is modern phrenology. Which, if you don't know the word, that was like when they thought they could feel bumps on your skull and know things about you, like how smart you were. Yeah.
Yeah, so, like, going back to this, the Jeff Bezos and Mohammed bin Salman, there was a couple of days ago a news story about something similar that happened to targeting Egyptian activists. So, it's not about marketing. If you think that you are a target to a regime like the Egyptian regime, where would you start? Where would you begin to just see if you've been compromised, if you've been hacked, as a normal citizen, as an activist? No.
I mean, well, for one thing, I would recommend reaching out to EFF and talking to the experts. I will be honest that, like, well, you know, I am a programmer for a living and do know a decent amount. I'm not like an expert at information security penetration testing. Like, you know, I'm not like a super trained expert on these specific issues. So, like, you know, I could tell you certain basic things you could look into. But, you know, my first recommendation would be, like, email the activists at EFF. They literally have experts on their staff for just this sort of thing. But there are things you can do. Like, suspicious network traffic on your devices is one thing to look for. There's a program you can use called Wireshark, which will let you do packet inspections on the packets your computer and phone is sending out. If it's sending packets to a weird domain you don't recognize at regular intervals, that might be a highly likely sign you've been compromised in some way. So that would actually be one of the first things I would check.
And I mean, for my friends who, from Syria and the revolution, you know, don't keep your contacts in your phone. Make sure your phone's password protected at all costs. Throw away phones, meet in person, don't speak in code. I mean, it's typical spy stuff, but I mean, they literally would say, you know, let's discuss your dog or something, and then they would meet at a location, and then they'd have to meet at a different location, and then sometimes a third and a fourth location to actually have the conversation. So when you take away the technology, especially, you know, under repressive regimes, like that's how this stuff really gets manifested in real life. You know, like that's how the action takes place. You know.
And I think I would add on to that advice that when you are going to meet, first of all, yeah, analog communication face-to-face is always safer than digital. Like, you know, if it's really sensitive, even if you're using Signal, you could have been compromised. So do it in person. And to that point, either don't bring your phone with you at all, which if you really are like worried that they might be literally using location services to track you, yeah, don't bring your phone at all. But if you're not quite at that point, but you still don't want to risk basic surveillance, you know, you can take your phone with you, but you probably want to put your phone in an RFID blocking like Faraday bag, you know, similar to what they give out at concerts, so that there isn't, even if the phone's been compromised, it can't phone home to the mothership, basically. Yes.
What are some of the, do you know some of the businesses in Austin that are currently innovating around privacy?
Innovating around privacy. Well, there is a lovely little nonprofit based here called the Operator Foundation that I recommend you check out. My friend Brandon Wiley runs it. Also, my friend Don Jackson's on the board of it. I have a few other friends who have been on the board of it, though they've moved on to other things. But Operator Foundation, they're a nonprofit. They use government grants to try to build bespoke encrypted communication software for journalists in embattled third world regimes where their safety might be at risk and they need to, communicate securely. So there are certainly people doing very interesting stuff in that space here in town that I recommend looking into their work.
Anybody besides the Operator Foundation?
Well, there's a local VPN provider who, if you want to like go local while getting your VPN, there's a company here called Golden Frog who makes a VPN called Viper VPN. I know a few of the people who have been over there. You know, I will say that I've heard, you know, from people I know who've actually worked there, I've heard mixed things about their company culture, but the people I know and trust have said the product itself is solid. Like, it's a good VPN. Like, you know, whatever you think of them positively or negatively as a company, they make a good product. And they are allies in this space, and they are locally based. And I will tell you, the guy who owns the company is like quite a character. He seems like he could have been out of a William Gibson novel, because he's this old Texan who wears a cowboy hat named Ron Yokubitis, who like is from this long-time Texas libertarian ranching family who like is like really hardcore when it comes to your privacy. I bumped into him one time at a South by Southwest party, and the way he described his product to me is like, when you're on the internet, you need a gun, and our VPN is your gun on the internet. And I'm like, that's an interesting way to put it. So, you know, they're certainly in this space, and, you know, they're making a VPN and doing good work. Their product's used a lot in China to help people get around the Great Firewall of China. So I applaud them for that work. Yes?
So you talked about how intrusive the Facebook app is in particular compared to the mobile, compared to like the desktop website.
Yes.
I'm just curious, in general, are mobile apps just going to be more intrusive than the website?
Yes. I mean, here's the thing. Always the least invasive thing is going to be going through your browser on your phone, because you're essentially putting a third-party company between you and the website/company itself. So your browser is enforcing standards on what data can and can't be collected. So sure, there's potentially the spying your browser itself is doing, but you can certainly eliminate company-specific targeted spying much easier when you're doing it through your web browser. You're in the company's app. You're really only limited by what the operating system doesn't let them do. And, you know, smart programmers often find ways around those limitations. But, I mean, it really depends on the company. Like, you know, I use apps on my phone. It really depends, because usually the app is easier to use than the web browser because it's been optimized for the phone. It's usually faster, the UI is usually cleaner, easier to use, etc. There's a reason we use apps, they're usually a superior experience on the phone. Gotten caught several times hacking their way around those limitations to still turn your microphone on and listen to you even when you're not using the app. So just, they're so egregious in violating your privacy with the app that I just kind of tell people, just don't use it. Like, they literally could be listening in on anything at any time, and you have no way of knowing. So, that's what I tend to recommend. I mean, you know, if you're gonna use it, and use all the other privacy recommendations I've given, you know. I'm not anybody's, you know, mom or dad, but I don't use it. Personally, I don't want to use it. Anybody else? You got no one? Sure.
Also, I mean, like, as regards Signal, I mean, I've heard of Signal, but, I mean, even if you're using something like Signal, I mean, if you're using it on an Android device, if you're using an Android device, basically, does that kind of throw everything out the window?
Well, I mean, this is where you always go with these debates. How far down the rabbit hole you want to go, how paranoid you want to get. I mean, you're absolutely right. You're using an Android. Google, by default, gathers a lot of information and data on you. Similarly, you use an iPhone. Apple's gathering a lot of information and data on you. And it's sort of pick your poison. Because on the one hand, Apple spies a lot less on you than Google does because their revenue streams are in hardware and not selling data and ads. So, now, don't think that means they don't spy on you at all. They do. But they do it a lot less. And, you know, they are serious when they actually try to, like, you know, tell people like the FBI, fuck off, we're not going to let you break into our phones. Like, they're serious. You know, and why wouldn't they be? It's good business for them to be able to portray themselves as caring about your privacy when none of the other big tech companies do. But, you know, at the same time, the price is you live in Apple's very walled ecosystem, where if you're a person who really wants to take your privacy into your own hands, you may be greatly limited by what Apple lets you do or not do, because they so lock down the phone OS that you don't have a lot of fine-tuned control over how it works. With Android, you sort of have the opposite problem. Google by default is spying on you much more on Android, but Android is also a far more extensible, hackable operating system. So if you're the type who's a little bit programming savvy and actually wants to take your privacy and mod your phone software into your own hands and actually maybe mod the OS enough that you legit block a lot of the spying and surveillance, it's a lot easier to do that on an Android phone. Like, rooting an Android phone is a pretty easy process. It's pretty dang hard on an iPhone. So, but I mean, you're getting fundamentally to the real problem all of us in the privacy space face, which is the only real way to guarantee our privacy would be to build a computer from scratch by soldering our own silicon boards together so we'd know there were no backdoors in the hardware and writing our own operating system. But you know, even people smart enough to figure out how to do that, it might take you 25 years to build a computer with the capabilities of a computer from the early 1980s. It's just not a realistic solution. And that's why fighting for legislation and laws becomes so important, because just saying, oh, well, just take matters into your own hands and build your own computer and write your own software, that's not practical. We don't have, any of us, 25 years to sit down and do that. We need laws that will actually protect our rights in place. Yes?
Currently on like Google Authenticator, is there other authenticators you suggest using?
I mean, yeah, I mean, if you don't want to use a Google Authenticator, there's a number of other ones. There's one called Authy. I know that I've heard at least one or two people tell me there's some problems with Authy too, but I mean, I've used it and it's been all right so far on some of the things I use it for, and I mean, you do get the it's not Google with Authy. There are some other ones out there. Frankly, my real recommendation is go check EFF's Surveillance Self-Defense Guide. Whatever they're currently recommending as a good two-factor app is probably pretty decent. They research this stuff pretty heavily. I think they do list Authy as one of their recommendations, and I think the other big one, which I'm blanking on its name, is listed there as the other recommendation. I don't think EFF has blacklisted Authy, so I think it's a fine one for the time being. I think, and I seem to recall the person who like had a bit of a reaction about it was like a real hackery type who would make me look not paranoid at all. So once again, it depends on your threat model. EFF always emphasizes there's no one size that fits all threat model. They can't just say do this and you're safe. It really depends on who you are and your needs. Yeah.
Has the proliferation of ransomware and the damage that is caused and the money that it's earned for the organized criminals who use it.
It's earned some of them a great deal of money, yes.
Sure. Has that affected, I won't say yours, but EFF's thoughts about privacy and approach to privacy and how society or even individuals should lobby for how we approach privacy as a public?
I mean, I don't necessarily want to speak for necessarily know all of EFF's thoughts on the topic. I mean,
there's
right,
a discussion.
Right. I mean, and they've had blog posts in their Deep Links blog on ransomware and talked about the phenomenon. I mean, I can just give my general recommendation on protecting yourself against ransomware, which is the only real safe defense against ransomware is regular periodic backups. Because you take regular periodic backups, well, it doesn't matter that they locked your whole computer down for a Bitcoin ransom. You know, they can go ahead and nuke it and you'll restore the backup.
Well,
and it's really, it's the, like, you know, all these cities and hospitals and people who've gotten pwned with these ransomware attacks, invariably they didn't have secure backups of their IT infrastructure going. People who do regularly every day back up their IT infrastructure, ransomware is not really an existential threat or danger to them. They end up fine. And that's really the only known foolproof defense against it. There's no magic security configuration you can do that means nobody can infect you with ransomware. Like, you know, it's like any of these security things. There's always a weakness. You can always get pwned. So the only real defense is regular backups.
Part of what I was trying to drive at is more generic and more broad than ransomware. The fact that privacy allows criminal behavior as well as,
Oh, I see where you're going with that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I certainly hear that. And I mean, yes, you know, everything in the world is trade-offs, you know, and we even discussed this about the tension between freedom of speech and privacy. And you're right that, you know, certain bad people use privacy to get away with terrible things. Though it's not as unprecedented a situation with the new technology as we often think it is, because criminals have always been able to use privacy and the technology of the day that enabled that privacy to get away with wrongdoing. This is not unique to computers. Like the EFF activist and sci-fi author Cory Doctorow, I thought, had a brilliant little way of putting it that makes it clear that this is not a unique thing about computers, where he basically said, let's say like in the past there was proof of somebody's criminal activities or wrongdoings that was written down on paper. Well, we've never mandated that paper has to be fireproof, even though there's nothing stopping the criminal from throwing all the papers in the fire and eliminating all the evidence of their crimes. We've never mandated paper has to be fireproof. And asking that we compromise encryption with backdoors in it, it's the exact same argument as mandating that paper has to be fireproof. Like, we don't... Strong encryption keeps us all safe from bad actors. And yes, there will always be people who abuse that, but you know, it's one of those things where, no, we don't live in a perfect world, but the gains to all our safeties from actually being able to protect ourselves with strong encryption so that governments and the very same criminal organizations, by the way, take advantage of those weaknesses in the security and encryption to steal our data, to steal our money, and to take advantage of us. So, yeah, are a few criminals going to use the privacy to, like, evade capture? Yeah, they are. But I would argue that the benefits to all our safety far outweigh the few random actors who are getting away with things they shouldn't as a result. Because, remember, as I said, it's a two-way street. We're making their ability to commit crime far harder when our privacy and our security is much stronger. Well, that's what I'd say on that. Probably have time for one or two more questions, then we gotta call it. Yeah.
So kind of earlier when you were talking about you know, confession in the Middle Ages, I was just wondering, I mean, do you think, or I guess do you know, did that feed into certain modern concepts like attorney-client privilege? Because I mean, at least to me, I see a parallel. I was just wondering if there actually is.
I mean, I'm not an expert historian on that stuff, and I also will say a little thing of asterisk about sort of developments in the concept of privacy. I will say, this is, you know, an area of scholarly debate. There's not universal consensus among scholars about necessarily where certain things in regards to privacy came from over the years. And I don't know off the top of my head if necessarily Catholic Church confession gave rise to attorney-client privilege. My hunch wants to say no, because I'm pretty sure it as a concept goes back at least to the Roman legal system, so which most of our legal system's indirectly based on. So I don't think it came from there, but at the same time, I'm really just speculating. I'd have to do more research on that topic. That being said, there is a lawyer that EFF Austin consults with sometimes who used to be on our board, who we've had speak occasionally, named Scott McCullough. He's quite an expert on the legal background of right to privacy and going back to ancient Rome and Greece, what the actual law around privacy topics was. He'd probably know better than me how far back you can trace privacy as a concept relating to attorney-client privilege, but I would suspect it goes back to at least Roman law, but don't quote me on that. Maybe time for one more if somebody has one. If not, it's fine. I've definitely talked a long time.
I mean, I have something else.
Sure, fine.
All right. So you talked about you know, Chrome as a browser, not so good for privacy. But what about like Chromium and other Chrome? I don't want to say Chrome-based builds that are kind of
well, the Brave browser actually is a Chromium fork, actually.
Okay.
So yeah. Brave was actually created by the guy who created JavaScript, Brandon Ike, actually. And yeah, it's an interesting browser because it's essentially Chrome. It's a Chromium fork. And what he does is he basically he tries to enforce more ethical, non-privacy violating practices on ads. Because one thing the browser does is that if it detects that an ad on a particular web page is spying on you, it will silently replace the ad with another ad that is not spying on you. So it kind of tries to thread that needle of, people saying, oh, well, we need ad revenue to give the site money and keep the site open. He's sort of trying to thread that needle of like, okay, there's still ads, just they're not spying on you. So it's an interesting browser as far as somebody trying to explore a model that can still address websites' needs under capitalism to make a living, but actually enforce better privacy norms. So yeah, that's a Chromium fork. I would frankly say, since we're almost out of time and it's a whole talk unto itself, but if you're interested, you should Google. There's actually a big debate right now when it comes to Chromium forks as far as copyright regulation, specifically the Widevine module in Chromium as an implementation of DRM and HTML5 under the encrypted media extensions part of the specification. A lot of debate around it and about essentially how Chrome's practices are both breaking open source Chromium forks as well as just open web standards. So I don't want to go too down that rabbit hole because it really is a whole talk unto itself, but I would recommend Googling more about it. And specifically, if you Google Cory Doctorow, who I alluded to earlier, this is one of his pet issues that he feels very passionately about. So he's blogged a lot about this issue and explains it in far greater depth and why it's very concerning to a free and open web than, frankly, I could ever explain, because he's like literally written, I think, 50 pages on it at this point. So that I'd recommend, if you're curious about that, you research that some more.
I'll duck, duck, go.
Yeah. All right, well, I think we're going to adjourn and wrap it up here. I want to thank everybody for coming, and hopefully you learned something. And I'll also say that for those of you who are interested, we usually, after the meetup, we adjourn nearby to Firehouse Hostel and Lounge to, have a drink and chat about these issues and not just have it all be one-sided with me or somebody else talking. So if you'd like to join us for a drink for a little bit, I encourage you to join us. But otherwise, thank you all for coming, and we'll see you. If we don't see you at our South by party in March, we'll see you in April when we have our next meetup. So thank you. Oh, one final thing I forgot to mention about the stuff we have coming up. This coming Saturday, we are hosting a screening of a play that is running at the Vortex Theater called The Hand That Feeds You. It's a one-weekend only show that the staff at the Vortex invited us to host tonight, one of the performances of. It's going to be very interesting because we like to spotlight interesting digital arts applications. This is a play that the creator of the play actually created an app specifically for the play that you use to sort of interact with the play and play along with it, and it enhances and becomes part of the multimedia experience that is the work of art in the play. So sounds very interesting. Frankly, I look forward to seeing exactly what they're going to do because I don't know much more than that. But, we're going to be there, and we encourage you to join us. If you check out the event descriptions on our Meetup and Facebook page, I don't have it memorized off the top of my head, but we have a coupon code that can get you $5 off any tier of ticket to the play. I can't make it free, unfortunately, because it's a one-weekend only engagement, and they need to make some money, but I can get you $5 off. And we also are going to be fundraising there to try to raise a little bit of money, hopefully, for our upcoming South by Southwest party. So encourage you to come out and get some dinner and have a drink with us and hopefully see an interesting play. So, yeah, hopefully I'll see you over at Firehouse Hostel and Lounge, but I'll see you next time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Frank, what are you doing here?
All the way from France.
Good for you. I just thought I'm not gonna get to hang with Eric on this. With Kevin on this trip if I don't come to this talk, and I'm just right around the corner. So I thought, heck yeah.
I guess after like years of getting those invitations, you're like, let me see what he actually does at these things.
No, I feel like it was lovely, man. It was so interesting and great.
This is what I do when I'm not at work.
Yeah, good to see you, bro. It's awesome.
Thank you so much for
Heck yeah.
coming. Hey, congrats on wrapping your film, man. I've been sort of
Alright.
following your little posts most of it on Facebook.
Yeah, well, we haven't, I don't know, we haven't, we definitely have the film in the can, save for a couple of inserts, but, we are, you know,
Is Eller acting in it or just running crew on
Eller
it?
was the art director.
Art director.
Yeah.
I know he's been moving more into the crew side of things. That's awesome.
Well, yeah, he was. Well, we had like multiple stitches going on. I mean, because initially we were going to go SAG on this project, and we have a child actor, and it was just gonna. Oh, Kevin, it was gonna add $10,000 to the shoot to have a chaperone, and
I'm
you know.
not surprised to hear.
Yeah,
You know?
so we just had to just and had we gone SAG, Eller would have acted in it, but he was more than happy to be art director, art department. He was key set dresser, and actually had a more expanded role at the end. So, but yeah, I'm just out. I'm here for a couple of weeks.
Well, thank you so much for coming out. I
Heck yeah,
really
man.
appreciate it.
Yeah, it's just a great talk. Loved it. And you're living in town now. Where are y'all living?
Me and Heather are in Oak Hill right now.
Oak Hill.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, we got a house down there.
Sweet. That's great, man.
Yeah, and I don't know, my day job is I'm working for a startup here in town called Civitech as one of their lead software engineers. We're trying to build tools for progressive political candidates to win their elections.
That's great.
So you know anybody in Alabama? Well, we're available for hire. We take
Heck yeah,
clients.
heck yeah, man. I love it.
Well, I know you do what you can for politics.
Yeah.
Doug Jones got a fight ahead of himself come November.
Yeah, I do it again. But you know, Doug, I've known Doug for years.
I know you've told me that
Yeah.
he goes way back. with
Way
him.
back, he was our fraternity advisor.
Well, I know that he had a very difficult vote there when it came to
Oh, it
impeachment.
was. And he's running against the football coach at Auburn.
Well, you know, I will say that he did the right thing. I know in Alabama that was a tough vote to do the right thing, but
Yeah.
he did it.
Thank God for the, I swear, the black female vote in Selma and South Alabama, because it was 100% Doug Jones. It's what carried the day.
Well,
It's crazy.
that's wonderful.
We're thankful for that. Yeah. Are y'all really going to Firehouse?
Yeah, you should
Yeah.
come.
I'm going to come for a second. Yeah. Heck
It's a
yeah.
fun little place. Have you been there?
I've been there with kids. Yeah, Bruce used to play there.
Oh.
So, and I'm seeing everyone. I saw my cousins live in Austin. I've been around yeah, I went to see
Oh, I love that movie, you got me.
Eller and I have been hanging for a couple of days. I'm gonna go out to the desert, enjoying what I hear. Bruce and Nana.
I remember bumping into you in that shop.
And then-
But thanks for coming. I appreciate it. I hope you learned something.
Yeah, I just need to get
Are
away.
you driving around somewhere?
Yeah.
We try to vary them, you know, because as I said, I was like, well, depending on who comes, they may be bored, you know.
And then the snowstorm
I'm glad
followed
it
it,
seems
so
like we had a number of people. that was on
most
this.
whack trip I've ever had.
I
just
get
got
so
tornado
involved in
in
this stuff that I
Shreveport, and
forget
hit
what's
Texas,
common
and like,
knowledge.
I've been in France, so I like don't know about what the hell
it was
happened.
crazy.
Was there
I
big
mean,
weather?
yeah, it's like when they were, well, it was a tornado in Birmingham, just as I had, it was just north of Birmingham as I was coming through.
Common?
In Alabama, it's very common. We're in Tornado Alley,